Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 15 years of her life quietly cataloging, annotating, and archiving old photographs at the Connecticut Historical Society. Thousands of faces had passed under her fingers. People who had lived, loved, and quietly disappeared into the mists of time. But none had ever taken her breath away, like that cold grey February morning. In a box donated by Elilana Whitman's estate among dozens of family photos, yellowed and cracked by the years, there was a single image that stopped Sarah. A 1911 portrait, an ordinary-looking one taken in a Hartford photo studio. A stern father stood behind him, dressed in formal attire. A mother sat in front in an elaborate Victorian dress. 3 children were lined up around them. 2 boys in matching sailor suits and a girl about 8 wearing a white, lace-trimmed dress. Everything seemed right for the period: the stony faces, the straight postures, the fixed gazes from the long exposures. But as Sarah brought the magnifying glass closer, her heart began to race. Something was wrong. The girl's eyes. They weren't the calm, stoic look of her parents, the familiar forbearance of early 20th century portraits. They held fear, and something she wanted to say but couldn't. Her small hands were in her lap, seemingly just sitting in a formal pose. But as the light from the desk lamp was adjusted, Sarah realized her hands were clenched. Her knuckles were white, and the way they were clasped together, not by accident, but on purpose. Sarah paused. She wasn't just posing. She was sending a signal that only those who understood the silent language of the time would recognize. With trembling hands, Sarah turned on her computer and accessed a database of historical photographs. And as the words appeared on the screen, her blood ran cold. The gesture in exact detail was a secret distress signal taught to children in the early 1900s. As the social reform movement began to spread, feminists and child welfare organizations devised discreet ways to help abused children send distress signals without their abusers knowing. One of them, taught at Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, was a particular finger placement in a photograph. A distress call sent through an image. Sarah felt her breath catch. Did the girl in the photograph know that it would take more than a century for anyone to see it? She immediately looked on the back of the photo, Hartwell Photography, Main Street, Hartford. With her professional curiosity, she searched through old records, then newspaper archives. And there, amid the fragments of the Hartford Courant, a somber piece of the puzzle emerged: a fire in late 1911. A family tragedy, it said briefly. Several members had died. No further details. Sarah looked back at the small face in the photograph. Those hands seemed to tremble in the current light, as if she was still waiting for someone to understand her. She had found more than an old photograph. She had heard a cry buried in silence. A cry for help that had transcended more than 100 years, heard at last. But what had the girl wanted to say? Had she known what was coming? Sarah knew she needed help. She sent a copy of the photograph to Dr. James Patterson of Yale University, who had spent his career studying distress signals and Reform-era child welfare. The response came almost immediately. Remarkable, he wrote. I've been studying these signals for 20 years, but this is one of the clearest examples I've ever seen. And so the story that seemed to have lain dormant in the 1911 photograph began to unfold. The girl's positioning is textbook, Dr. Patterson said, quietly, his gaze fixed on the photograph. She's signaling immediate physical danger inside the home. They agreed to meet the next morning at the Historical Society. When Dr. Patterson arrived, he carried a worn leather briefcase filled with fragile papers, reports, manuals, correspondence from the earliest years of child protection. He laid them gently across Dr. Mitchell's desk, the yellowed pages forming a silent timeline of social reform in early 20th century Connecticut. "The signal your girl is using," he explained, pointing to a faded diagram in a 1910 social worker's manual, was specifically taught to indicate physical abuse. But look closer, see her thumb. That detail was added around 1911. It meant the child's life was in immediate danger. A chill passed through Dr. Mitchell. The child hadn't just been frightened, she had known what was coming. Together, they began tracing the family's history. The photography studio's ledgers had been donated to the society decades earlier. After hours of patient searching, they found it, Family Portrait, September 15, 1911. Paid by Thomas Hartford, 47 Maple Street. City directories confirmed the rest. Thomas Hartford, foreman at the Hartford Manufacturing Company. His wife, Mary. Their 3 children, Robert, age 12, William, 10, and Emma, age 8, Emma. The name felt like a whisper reaching across time. Dr. Mitchell felt an almost physical connection to her. This little girl who had tried so desperately to be heard through a photograph. But when they searched further, that fragile line of connection seemed to vanish. After September 1911, the Hartford family disappeared from every official record. No city directory, no census entries, no school lists, no death certificates. It was as if the entire family had been quietly erased from Hartford's history within weeks of the photograph being taken. Mitchell and Patterson spent the next week combing through every archive, every database. But the result was always the same nothing. Not silence by accident, but silence with intent. Dr. Mitchell decided to go there herself, 47 Maple Street. The neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. The house was gone, replaced by a dry cleaner and a small coffee shop. Yet, as she stood on the cracked sidewalk, she tried to imagine the sound of 1911, the laughter of children, the creak of the front gate, the quiet dread behind Emma's eyes. At City Hall, an elderly clerk named Robert Chen remembered once handling old property records from that very block. He pulled a heavy folder from a metal drawer, the paper brittle and stained with age. There was a bad fire on Maple Street in 1911, he recalled softly. Destroyed several homes. The city had to rebuild the whole block. The insurance records told a partial story. The Hartford house had indeed burned down in November 1911, just 2 months after the family portrait. Cause, suspicious origin. And underlined in red ink, no remains recovered. Dr. Mitchell decided to go there herself. 47 Maple Street. The neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. The house was gone, replaced by a dry cleaner and a small coffee shop. Yet, as she stood on the cracked sidewalk, she tried to imagine the sound of 1911, the laughter of children, the creak of the front gate, the quiet dread behind Emma's eyes. At City Hall, an elderly clerk named Robert Chen remembered once handling old property records from that very block. He pulled a heavy folder from a metal drawer, the paper brittle and stained with age. There was a bad fire on Maple Street in 1911, he recalled softly. Destroyed several homes. The city had to rebuild the whole block. The insurance records told a partial story. The Hartford house had indeed burned down in November 1911, just 2 months after the family portrait. Cause suspicious origin. And underlined in red ink, no remains recovered. Meanwhile, Patterson uncovered something equally unsettling in the state archives. Employment records from the Hartford Manufacturing Company showed that Thomas Hartford stopped coming to work on October 30, 1911. His supervisor had written one final note in the company ledger: Hartford absent without notice, position terminated. A timeline was forming now, stark, chilling, and undeniable. Between the photograph in September and the fire in November, something terrible had happened. Emma's small, trembling hands had not been wrong. Her signal had been prophetic. In the Hartford Current Archives, a small, nearly forgotten article from December 1911 appeared on page 6. It mentioned an ongoing police investigation into the unexplained disappearance of a local family. The inquiry, it said, had been suspended due to lack of evidence. One line stood out. Neighbors had reported seeing the family leaving their home hurriedly in late October, carrying suitcases, appearing distressed. One witness recalled, the children looked frightened. Emma had tried to tell anyone, that she was in danger. No one had listened. Until now. And then came a break neither of them expected. While researching neighborhood records at the public library, Dr. Mitchell overheard an elderly woman speaking softly to a librarian about old family photographs. My grandmother lived on Maple Street in 1911, the woman was saying. She used to talk about a family that vanished one night, just gone. No one ever found out why. Her name was Helen Murphy, 87 years old. Her grandmother, Catherine Murphy, had lived at 45 Maple Street, directly next door to the Hartford family. Grandmother kept a diary, Helen said, when Dr. Mitchell approached her. She wrote in it every day. Mother used to joke she was the neighborhood historian. But honestly, I've never really read it. A few days later, Helen retrieved the diary from her attic, its cover darkened with time, the ink faded but legible. And as they turned the fragile pages together, Catherine Murphy's voice began to return. She had written extensively about her neighbors, about the Hartford family, and the entries from 1911 painted a portrait of quiet dread, of rising tempers, and late-night shouting, of windows closed even in the summer heat. The first of those entries began simply, September 20th, 1911. The shouting from Hartford House grew worse with each passing night. Poor Mary did her best to quiet Thomas, but his temper had deepened with drink since losing that promotion at the factory. The children too had learned silence small frightened witnesses to storms they could not calm. October 5th, 1911. Little Emma came to my garden fence today while I was hanging laundry. She didn't say a word, but I saw the bruises, dark fingerprints blooming across her pale arms. When I asked if she'd been hurt, she only shook her head and ran home without a sound. Something is terribly wrong in that house. October 15th, 1911. Thomas Hartford came home in a fury tonight. I heard his voice, rising money, blame the crack of glass against the wall. Mary was crying and one of the boys was begging him to stop. I fear this cannot continue. The final entry came on October 28, 1911. I fear the worst has happened. I haven't seen Mary or the children in 3 days. Thomas, though, comes and goes at strange hours. This morning before dawn, I saw him load several large bundles into a wagon. When I called to him, he turned eyes hollow and told me to mind my own business. Those children, I believe they're in grave danger. Catherine Murphy's words became the only voice left for the Hartford family, an accidental record of what no one else saw. In 1911, there were no systems to protect children from family violence. Emma's quiet cry for help in a photograph, a hand gesture. A bruised silence had been the only trace she could leave behind. Years later, her image and Catherine Murphy's diary would draw the attention of Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson historians, whose research into forgotten domestic cases had already revealed haunting truths. Murphy's note about the wagon, the bundles before dawn, it suggested the family hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken somewhere. Dr. Patterson began reaching out to colleagues across New England, hoping to find any record, any trace of where Thomas Hartford might have gone. It was Dr. Rebecca Foster at the University of Vermont who finally answered. We've documented dozens of men who fled the cities after losing work, Dr. Foster explained over the phone. They'd take their families to the wilderness, isolated places where no one asked questions. She'd found land records from November 1911. A cash purchase made by Thomas Hartford, 20 acres of remote woodland in northeastern Vermont, nearly 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by primitive logging roads. The transaction had occurred just days after Catherine Murphy's last diary entry. Dr. Mitchell felt a chill. Emma's warning had been even more precise than anyone realized. Somehow the child had sensed that her family was about to be taken to a place where no one would hear them scream. Local archives in Vermont filled in the grim outline. The area was known for its brutal winters and fatal isolation. Families who tried to homestead there often didn't survive the first cold season. Yet what troubled Dr. Foster most were supply records showing that Thomas Hartford had visited the land alone in December 1911 and again in January 1912, buying tools, food, and fuel. If his family had gone with him, why was he always alone? That question lingered in Dr. Mitchell's mind like frost that wouldn't melt. Emma's silent hand signal from that September photograph wasn't merely a record of abuse. It had been something far darker, a desperate attempt to leave proof of her existence before she disappeared forever. There was only one thing left to do. They had to go there. So, on a cold March morning, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson set out for northeastern Vermont. Local historian and archaeologist Dr. Maria Santos joined them, an expert in tracing long-lost homestead sites. The land that Thomas Hartford had bought in 1911 still existed, now buried within a larger tract owned by a paper company. With the help of old survey maps and GPS coordinates, they hiked through dense, snowbound forest to what had once been Hartford's land. The woods were silent, so silent, it felt as though sound itself had fled the place. Dr. Santos carried ground-penetrating radar, her instrument humming softly against the stillness. The climb was brutal, the cold biting through their modern winter gear. No sound of civilization reached them. No service, no roads, just the wind in the trees. Dr. Mitchell couldn't stop thinking about Mary and the children arriving here in November 1911, with winter closing in nowhere to run. After several hours, the radar began to whisper back. Subtle anomalies beneath the snow, a buried shape, a foundation. They began to dig carefully, the sound of shovels breaking through frozen soil echoing in the hollow air. And then, there it was, the remains of a small wooden structure, barely a single room. Scattered nearby were fragments of pottery, rusted tools, scraps of fabric that time itself had failed to claim. But one object stopped them all. Dr. Santos brushed away the dirt to reveal a small metal ribbon, delicate, made of thread that had resisted decay. A child's hair ribbon, and though the forest around them was silent, Dr. Mitchell thought she could almost hear a little girl's voice in that still air, whispering across the century, "I was here." The ribbon. It matched perfectly with the one Emma Hartford had worn in that faded 1911 photograph. Dr. Santos examined it in silence, her breath visible in the cold air. Nearby, the soil was blackened. Charcoal fragments melted, metal signs, not of a home lost to accident, but of deliberate destruction. Someone had tried to erase everything here. Local records from Vermont confirm the rest. Thomas Hartford's final recorded visit to the property occurred in February 1912. After that, nothing. No work documents, no census entries, no trace at all. The land was eventually taken back by the state for unpaid taxes, as if time itself had quietly folded the Hartford family into its shadows. Before leaving, Dr. Mitchell held the tiny metal ribbon in her gloved hands. That fragile piece of wire and thread was all that remained of a little girl who had once tried in her own silent way to tell the world she was in danger. Her message, hidden in the careful position of her hands in a photograph, had finally been received. But discovery wasn't enough. Emma Hartford deserved to be remembered. Back home from Vermont, Dr. Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that she now carried a responsibility, not just as a historian, but as a witness. She reached out to local newspapers trying to tell Emma's story. Yet, as she read the first drafts, she realized this wasn't only history. It was a warning and a plea that stretched beyond time. With Dr. Patterson and Dr. Santos, she assembled a detailed report, photographs, field notes, the diary excerpts of Catherine Murphy, and sent it to major history journals. Soon the story spread far beyond New England. Newspapers wrote about it. Historical magazines featured Emma's photograph. But it was on social media that her voice truly rose again. Parents, child advocates, and historians shared her story. Discussions bloomed about how far society had come and how far it still had to go. Emma's image became a quiet symbol of resilience, of what it means to speak without words, and how important it is that someone listens. The Connecticut Historical Society opened a special exhibition titled Silent Voices, Children's Stories from the Past. At its center hung the 1911 Hartford family photograph, Emma's small hands, positioned just so explained in gentle detail beneath the glass. Curators displayed early 20th century hand signals used by reformers to help children wordlessly express fear or distress, remnants of an early fragile understanding of child protection. For the first time in more than a century, Emma's secret signal was finally being understood. Child advocacy groups began including her story in their training materials, showing volunteers and social workers how vital it is to recognize when children are trying to communicate danger. The old signals themselves were no longer needed. but the lesson behind them remained timeless. Dr. Mitchell continued her research tracing genealogy records to locate any descendants of the Hartford line. What she found was heartbreaking and healing. Thomas Hartford had a brother who'd stayed in Connecticut. His descendants still lived near Hartford itself. When Dr. Mitchell reached out, they were stunned. They had grown up hearing vague, uneasy tales about relatives who disappeared, but no one had ever known why. Now at last, they did. The family asked Dr. Mitchell for help in creating a memorial for Mary and for her 3 children, Robert William and Emma. They wanted to make sure that those erased from records by violence would never again be erased from memory. Together they planned a quiet ceremony, something not just to mourn but to honor the bravery of a child who in her own way had tried to save them all. The memorial service was held on a warm September morning in 2024, exactly 113 years after that final photograph had been taken. Grove Hill Cemetery in Hartford was still and green. That morning the grass jeweled with dew. A simple stone stood at the center, erected through donations from the community and child welfare organizations. Dr. Mitchell spoke softly to the gathered crowd descendants, historians, child advocates, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Emma's story. Emma Hartford could not speak openly, she said, but she found another way. She left us her voice through her hands positioned so carefully, so deliberately, that even a century later they could still be read. The memorial stone bore a single powerful inscription beneath the names of Mary Hartford and her 3 children. Their silence has been broken. Their story lives on. Representatives from child protection agencies came forward to speak, each one reflecting on how Emma's courage had influenced their work. The specific hand signals she'd used were no longer taught, but their meaning endured. Children, they said, will always find ways to communicate when they are in danger. It is up to adults to notice, to listen, to respond. Local schools requested copies of the exhibition materials, and soon Emma's story became part of Hartford's official historical curriculum. In classrooms across the city, students learned not just about a century-old tragedy, but about the enduring strength of a young girl's voice, a voice that refused to disappear. And as Dr. Mitchell stood quietly by that new memorial stone, she thought about how far Emma's signal had traveled from a frightened child's hidden plea to a message that would echo in classrooms, museums, and hearts for generations to come. The Hartford family descendants stood together beneath the autumn sunlight, their faces marked by quiet astonishment and sorrow. "We always wondered about the relatives who disappeared," said James Hartford, Thomas Hartford's great-great-nephew. Learning the truth was painful, but it was also necessary. Emma, her mother, and her brothers deserved to be remembered. As the service drew to a close, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward. In her hand, she held a single white rose, the same kind that Emma had worn pinned to her dress in the 1911 photograph. She placed it gently on the memorial stone. The flower symbolized remembrance, but also hope that Emma's courage might continue to protect other children long after her voice had fallen silent. The original photograph returned to its place of honor at the Connecticut Historical Society. But now, it was no longer just a picture of a family. It was the story of a message finally understood of a little girl, whose hands had at last been heard. 6 months later, a letter arrived on Dr. Mitchell's desk. It came from a teacher in California who had used Emma's story to teach her students about history research and child safety. One of my students noticed something the teacher wrote. After learning about Emma's hand signals, she recognized that her great-grandmother in a 1920s family photograph seemed to be making the same gesture. We began researching, and we've already uncovered evidence of domestic abuse that had been hidden for generations. Emma's voice, silent for more than a century, was now echoing forward, helping others uncover and confront their own buried truths. Dr. Mitchell sat for a long time after reading the letter, realizing that this was the true meaning of her work. Not merely cataloging history, but helping the past speak to the present in ways that could still heal and protect. The Connecticut Historical Society soon established the Emma Hartford Research Grant, funding historians who studied the early history of child welfare and domestic violence. Dr. Patterson used the first grant to digitize thousands of early 1900s family photographs, training volunteers to notice subtle signs that might once have been overlooked, small gestures, patterns, or hidden signals in plain sight. Modern child protection agencies also began drawing lessons from Emma's case. Social workers were taught to pay attention to nonverbal communication, to understand that a child's plea for help might come not in words, but in silence posture or a gesture too easily dismissed. From tragedy, a movement had quietly grown. Dr. Mitchell often returned to the museum's main exhibition hall, where Emma's photograph now hung under soft light. Visitors stopped often to study it, their faces changing as they read the inscription beside it. Some lingered in silence, others wiped away quiet tears. Emma Hartford never lived to know that her message would one day be understood. She never knew that her courage would ripple through time, inspiring protection for children she would never meet. But her voice had endured through the stillness of a photograph, through the compassion of strangers, through the determination of those who refused to let her story fade. Her hands frozen in that 1911 image had become a bridge across centuries, a connection between past and present, reminding the world that even the smallest signal can carry a truth worth hearing. Emma's story had finally become what she had always hoped it would be: a message seen, a voice heard, and a light that would never again go out.